This week, we'll be covering the modern women's movement, beginning in the 1940s until today. First, we'll look at World War II with women in the workforce, and continue on with women in civil rights. Then we'll move on to the radical 1960s and 70s feminist movement, and merge into women in the government, beginning in the late 70s. And finally, we'll close with women in the internet today. First, we'll look at World War II with women in the workforce. So with the 1940s began World War II, where most of the men were sent off to Europe or the Pacific for war, which left many factory positions open, as well as clerical military positions that were left unfilled. And so you had women who stepped into these positions where you had never seen anything like this before. Women in the workforce grew exponentially due to this need. And you had propaganda influence such as Rosie the Riveter, who encouraged women to step up into these roles that were mostly held by men up until this point. Well, after World War II, you saw the men come back and the women removed from these positions. And with this, you saw not only the rise of civil rights with African Americans, but you saw women joining in this movement as well. The most notable one is Rosa Parks, with the bus sitting and then being thrown in jail, and then afterwards her using her story to help encourage not only African Americans but women to stand up for their rights. With this, there was not only legislation that resulted from the civil rights movement that impacted the equality of minorities, but also it impacted the equality of women in hiring practices and pay. So with this new concept of equality in pay and hiring, you also saw more women entering higher education during the 1960s and 70s. And with this brought about the feminist movement, coupled with the radical Vietnam era riots. So you have these radical Vietnam era riots where they were protesting the military, and you had women protesting not only higher pay and equal hiring practices, but they were also starting to challenge the norms of society. You saw women no longer wanting to be stay-at-home wives. You saw them wanting to enter the workforce and become doctors and lawyers and professors. You also saw women begin to demonstrate these desires in more radical and violent ways. Most notably, in 1968 in the Miss America pageant, you saw bra burning outside the pageant in protest of this classic, beautiful women stay at home, raise their children, and do not work. And so you not only saw this in America, you also saw this at the Miss Universe pageant just a few years later. You saw it throughout Europe as well. With the rise of the radical feminist movement, you also saw women becoming more prominent in government. The most notable first one was Margaret Thatcher, who rose to power in England as Prime Minister in 1979 and stayed in her position until 1990. You also saw Geraldine Ferraro, who was the first liberal vice presidential candidate in the 1984 campaign. In international politics, you see the rise of Yulia Tymoshenko in Ukraine in the 2000s, specifically 2005 to 2010. In American politics, you see Nancy Pelosi becoming the first female Speaker of the House in 2007 to 2011. And finally, conservative Sarah Palin becoming the first conservative vice presidential candidate in the 2008 presidential campaign. So as you see, the feminist movement not only encouraged women to become doctors, lawyers, and abandon the stay-at-home wife mentality, you also saw the rise of women being involved in government. With the rise of the internet in the 1990s, you also began to see what we affectionately refer to now as hashtag activism. Most recently, the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls was used by many celebrities, specifically the most famous picture of Michelle Obama holding up the piece of paper with hashtag Bring Back Our Girls after Boko Haram kidnapped around 40 girls from a school in Nigeria. And this social media response was an attempt to not only gain recognition of this act, but to encourage governments to act upon this and to help bring these girls back home. You also saw in the 2000s a young Pakistani feminist who was attacked by terrorists. Her name was Malala Yousafzai, and she gained national attention not only through social media but through 24/7 news for her desire to be educated in a world where, it was specifically the Islamic world, where education was frowned upon for women. And just a year ago, she received the Nobel Peace Prize. So as we've seen, the modern feminist movement not only impacted liberal women, but also benefited conservative women, specifically in politics. But you also see the rise of just being aware of not only minority African American issues, but women issues such as inequality in pay and hiring practices. This is something that still has not really been reconciled, and I encourage you to look at these women and these different events that occurred and to see how this affects your life today.